I'll start this build by making a neck, and for this build I've decided to use a 5-piece multi-laminate neck, which is 3 pieces maple and 2 pieces Purpleheart. So what I'm doing here is cutting out the individual pieces of the neck, and I'm cutting them in such a way that when I glue them together, this will essentially book match the grain. So 2 pieces of Purpleheart and 2 pieces of maple will have grain going in the opposite direction once they're in the neck, and this will help to keep the neck straight and prevent it from twisting and warping after it's all put together. Here you can see I'm gluing the neck together in 2 stages because I don't want the pieces of wood to slide around while the glue is being clamped up. Now I'm running the glued up neck blank through the jointer so that it will have a smooth and flat working surface for the area that the fretboard will be attached to. And now cutting out the headstock angle. I am purposefully cutting very slow to avoid having the blade wander at all. Wouldn't want to cut the headstock too thin. And here a second pass just to clean it up. Now that I've finished that step, I'm moving on to carving the channel for the truss rod. You can see I'm using a straight board over on the side there as a guide fence for the router to make sure that the truss rod channel is straight. After that, I cut out the rough profile of the neck. Now using a neck shape template, I'm using a flush cutting router bit to get it to the final shape. And now using the drill press to cut out part of the shape of the headstock. And the excess just pops right out. A little bit more shaping of that stock. And drilling for access to the truss rod. Start by drilling straight in so that the tip of the drill bit has something to grab onto and not wander around when I move it into this angle for the final hole. Now cutting out the rough shape of the fretboard, leaving some excess to be removed after it's attached to the neck. You can see I've already marked out where the fret slots will be cut, and those marks are made with a knife that I can then follow with the saw. inserting the truss rod into the channel and placing some tape over it so that no wood glue gets into the truss rod channel when I'm attaching the fretboard. And cutting away the excess. Here I'm drilling through a couple of fret slots so that I have the ability to use some locating pins so that once I do glue the fretboard on, I know it's not going to slide around when I clamp it up. It will attach exactly where I want it to. Now cutting away some of the excess material from the fretboard. It's just a rough cut for now, and then I will go in with another flush cutting router bit to finish it off. And there's the flush cutting router bit. Different from the one I used earlier, this one has the bearing at the top instead of the bottom. So what I'm doing now, I had noticed that once everything was squared up with the fretboard, that there was a bit of an issue with the original fret slots as they were cut, in that they weren't quite in exactly the right place. But there was a second problem where the fretboard itself was much thicker than I needed it to be. So these two things actually worked out pretty well in my favor because I could just sand off all of the excess thickness from the fretboard and then get a free redo on the fret slots, which is what I'm cutting now. Taking it very carefully. So now that that's been done, I'm going in with the radius block to set the radius of the fretboard. This is a 10-inch radius. As you can see here, carving in the radius has sanded through the ends of the fret slots, so I have to go in and recut those to the appropriate depth. Now that's fairly easy since the middle of the fret slot is still there and the saw blade likes to follow it. And at this point I decided to get a little bit ambitious and try to do a custom inlay. I didn't have the appropriate inlay routing bits at that point, so I went in and did most of it with the drill press. And I've decided to make the inlay out of some of the same wood that's going on the top of the body, and this is Buckeye Burl. Making some very careful cuts on the bandsaw. And while I'm here, I'm also cutting out a piece to be a veneer on the front of the headstock. And move over to the drum sander with one of its smallest sanding drums to work on the shape of the pieces for the inlay. Going to have to go in with some hand tools to finalize them, and here's a dry fit. So after that I glued those in, and now I'm sanding them down to match the radius of the fretboard. So here I'm sanding down the thickness of that headstock veneer because I also don't want to make the headstock too thick by adding this. And then gluing it into place. Once the glue is dry, I'm going in with the drum sander once more to get the headstock veneer even with that shape of the headstock. And then I move on to carving the neck profile. This is a Shinto saw rasp. Wonderful tool. It's a fairly time-consuming process to carve a neck this way, but you get a lot of control over the exact results, and you can make the neck the exact shape that you want it to be. And steps like this could also be done with an angle grinder. It would be much faster, but also much riskier, because if you go too far, you've got a problem. Now I'm going in with a round file to carve the shape at the heel, and then also for shaping the volute. These shots are a little shaky. I had the camera sitting on the desk just to get a good angle. And then going in with a random orbital sander to smooth out the neck. Lots of hand sanding to follow. So here I'm just using a 3-corner file to open up the tops of the fret slots just to make it a little bit easier to get the frets in, and that should also help prevent tear out if the frets ever need to be replaced later on. And then installing the frets. Then moving on to leveling the frets. And I had checked to make sure that the fretboard was totally flat before moving on to this step, but the camera couldn't see what I was doing very well when I did that, so I haven't bothered including that shot. And then once the frets are leveled, I move on to crowning. First with a crowning file, then with a little bit of 600 grit sandpaper to smooth them over a little. And after the sandpaper, I move on to some fret rubbers, going up from coarse to extra fine. This is the coarse one, but even just with this one, you can see how much shinier that one fret is. Here's the extra fine, and again, once I'm done here, you'll be able to see how much smoother that one fret is compared to the others around it. It's much shinier. Now I'm using a center point drill bit to follow some pilot holes I had made for the tuning pegs. And I'm starting by drilling most of the way through from the front, and then flipping it over and meeting that original hole from the back. And doing it this way is to help prevent tear-outs. So now it's almost fully prepared. Here I am working on the nut. This is a buffalo horn nut, and I'm just lightly beginning the string slots in that. I'll get to finalize those later on once I can actually put the strings on it, see what the action is, and how much farther I need to file them. So now that I'm as far as I can go with the neck for now, moving on to the body. I'm gluing the top onto the body. As I mentioned earlier, it's a Buckeye Burl top being glued onto a 3-piece Alder body. roughly cutting the shape of the bandsaw, then moving on to the drum sander. Now, a lot of people complain that I do a lot of my shaping with the drum sander rather than having a template and using the router bits to just do the shape the same way every single time, but I really like going in and shaping with the drum sander because I can work out the shape by feel, and especially in the case of this body, the shape of the body changed quite a bit from the original design just because of how it felt while I was working on it. Sort of like letting the wood tell me what shape it wants to be more than forcing it to follow the design that I had drawn up earlier. So now I was carving some of the surface of the body. This was fairly difficult because Buckeye Burl is relatively soft and also extremely cross-grained. So carving it like this, the wood liked to tear out a lot, so it was quite difficult getting it smooth. The alder, on the other hand, was much easier. Now, this is the comfort carve on the back. And you can see my whole carving process for these, beginning with a very rough round file, moving on to a saw rasp, and then going to a random orbital sander. So what I'm doing here is I'm applying a wood hardener to the Buckeye Burl on the surface, and this is to help stabilize the wood and try to avoid any more risk of tear-outs or things like that. And this is essentially a very, very thin super glue. It's about as thin as water, and it soaks into the wood extremely fast. Now that I've got the top stabilized, I'm moving on to mixing up some epoxy resin to fill the holes in the wood. You can see I've got this powder is like a black perloid powder, though I may have mixed in too much. It's hard to tell. It's very dark and you can't really get much impression of the perloid swirling in it. Although with the light, when the light hits it the right way, it's fairly sparkly. Well, for most other angles, it just looks solid black. If I end up using a method like this again, I'll probably use a little bit less of that powder. And just going around filling in all of the voids. Now going over that resin with the torch just to get rid of all the bubbles on the surface of the resin. Now once all the resin is dry, coming in with the random orbital sander to sand it all flat. So now I'm ready to start carving out the neck pocket, beginning with the drill press to remove most of the material and then clean it up with the router. Now there I am with the router and a routing template. Now that that's done, going over to where the pickups are going to be. Again, removing most of the material with the drill press, and then I'm going to go in again with the router to clean these up. And there they are. So now moving on to cutting out the control cavity. What I've been doing lately for control cavities is to set up guide fences, but since with this body there aren't really very many straight lines to follow, I ended up doing it mostly by hand and then cleaning it up with chisels. Now I need a back plate to cover up that control cavity, and I'm using some of the leftover Buckeye Burl. just working that to shape with the drum sander. Here's the test fit. And it's a good fit. Wood is a little bit warped, but that's not a big problem. I'll say that's another thing with the Buckeye Burl, it likes to warp quite a bit while you're working with it. And probably because of the extremely cross-grained nature of the wood itself. Now I'm drilling a pilot hole for where the jack plate is going to go. So, much like the base that I made, that was inspired by Nevin, going in and essentially sinking the jack plate into the body like this so that it's mostly hidden when you're looking at it from the front. Or from the back, or most of the sides for that matter. And I'm drilling access so that the wires from the pickups can get through to the control cavity. It's at this point I've decided to change the shape of the body a little bit and remove some material up on that end to allow for more access to the top of the fretboard. And a little bit more carving on the back, again to improve fretboard access. At this point, I decided that I didn't entirely like how pale the back of the body was, and that the wood was just sort of plain looking, so my solution to that was to set it on fire. I know some people, when they do things like this, they burn it completely black, but I didn't want to take it that far. Removing most of the charring with the wire brush, and then getting it smooth once again with random orbital sanders. And now applying the first coat of finish. I could go out of my way and show multiple coats being applied, but really there's only a reason to show the first coat going on, because after that they all pretty much look the same, but the first coat you can really see what's being done. And a few hours later, first coat on the back. Really brought out a lot of the color from the charring. It's a very warm color on the back. So now that all the finish is on, doing another test fit of the neck just to make sure that the neck pocket hasn't gotten filled up with gunk and leftover finish. Looks good. Alright, so now that I made sure the fit is good, get to glue the neck into place. Oddly enough, it slid into the neck pocket much easier once the glue was in there. Guess that lubricated the joint a bit. So now painting the inside of the control cavity with an electrically conductive shielding paint. And then I'm going in and just putting in some regular black paint inside the pickup cavities, mostly for appearances. So now I'm moving on to applying finish to the neck. I specifically waited to put any finish on the neck until after it was attached to the body, because I didn't want any finish getting onto the heel of the neck, because that would cause a weaker glue joint with the body. And see, the first coat actually looked pretty good on the neck, but I'm still sanding it down and doing multiple coats to make sure that it's properly protected and preserved and also feels good. So now I'm marking out where I'll need to drill for the screws for the bridge. That's one of the things I like about this bridge. It only takes 3 screws, and you don't have to get quite the level of precision that you would with something like a Tune-o-matic, where if you're a little bit off, the bridge simply will not fit on the pegs. And this one you just screw right on. It's both a bridge and a tailpiece. It's also a very highly adjustable bridge, which I like, because the saddles can move forward and back, up and down, and then they also have rollers on them, so you can adjust the exact spacing in between each string to whatever you want them to be. It's really quite nice. So now I'm putting in the potentiometers and the toggle switch. Now fitting in the tuning pegs. Once I've got them lined up the way I want them to be, going in with an awl and marking out where to drill for the attaching screws. And then screwing them into place. And of course, once the screws are in, I get to go and tighten down the nuts on the top. Now prepping to install the pickups. These are some very nice looking pickups that I had ordered from a company called Knuckle. Really like how they look on this body. So it's at this point I noticed that I had forgotten something, which is to drill a channel for a ground wire to the bridge. So that was fairly simple to just take the bridge back off and drill afterwards. So there you can see the wire sticking out, and I'm attaching the bridge once again. Nice, now that the wiring's all in place, I can put the back plate on. And we're nearly done. I can drill for the strap box. I just had some tape on top of the pickups. There was some steel wool involved in the finishing process for this, so I make sure to put some tape over the pickups whenever they're near the working surface to make sure none of that steel wool sticks to the magnets in them. Now I'm applying some oil to the fretboard just to liven it up and preserve it, make sure it doesn't dry out. So like I mentioned earlier, I hadn't totally finished working on the nut. It needs to be filed down. As you can see here, the action is extraordinarily high. So now that the strings are on it, I can actually see just how high the action is and how much I need to file down each string slot. You can see now that the action is much improved, though I could still take it a bit lower, but that is essentially the instrument done, and I can move on to giving a little bit of a demo.